Welcome back. Welcome back. And first of all, in this second half, Harry Shearer. Harry Shearer is a man of many parts. He started acting when he was 7, and now at the age of 66, he's not only an actor, but an author, a satirist, a radio host, a musician, and possibly most famously of all, the voice of many of the characters on that global phenomenon that is The Simpsons. His latest project is a documentary, a more serious one this, about the disaster in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit the city 5 years ago. The Big Unease investigates and aims to prove that the devastation in New Orleans was not a natural disaster, as some try to say, but instead an unnatural disaster caused by people. Harry Shearer is with me right now, but first let's take a look at his documentary.
We all know what happened to New Orleans on August 29th, 2005. Katrina.
The biggest natural disaster.
Katrina was a natural disaster.
A major American city went through a natural disaster.
Unlike Katrina, where you had a natural disaster.
Katrina, the hurricane, did so much damage in New Orleans.
This natural disaster befell New Orleans.
And yes, it's true, the Mississippi Gulf Coast did suffer devastating damage from a hurricane that day. But as a part-time resident of New Orleans, I became aware over the weeks and months that followed the flood, as did everybody else here, that there was a very different side to that story.
The Corps of Engineers were claiming that the surge was so high it came over these walls and eroded the bottom, and that's why they failed, and therefore it wasn't their fault. But what we soon discovered was that the surge only got to about here. It never got to the top of the wall.
On the 17th Street Canal, you can see that the 6-foot wall is gone, and you can see the water pouring through.
What really caught your imagination about Katrina and what was wrong with it? Was it partially just because you're a semi-resident of New Orleans, or was it more than that?
It was the fact that I'm a resident of New Orleans for much of the year, and that those of us in the city had been treated through dribs and drabs to the unveiling of this story of what really happened. And my outrage that after now 5 years, A, the American people didn't know the true nature of the problem, and B, that therefore the political response to the problem was woefully inadequate. The same people who had almost destroyed the city had been given $14 billion to go do it again without any change in the way they did business, without any increase in independent oversight of them, without any adult supervision, arguably. And I thought that knowledge would sort of maybe help that process along a little bit.
And also, I mean, people talked about the fact of this being a natural disaster and so on. I mean, and one of your pressing points in the documentary is that, no, it was man-made.
Yes, it's not my point. It is the point of the 2 independent investigations that spent a year on the ground with distinguished scientists and engineers from 2 major universities and their associates. Both came to the conclusion, in the words of one of the leaders of the investigations, that this was the greatest man-made engineering catastrophe since Chernobyl. Chernobyl's the big leagues. I mean,
that's serious.
Yeah, and that just somehow eluded the attention of the major media in the United States, and still does.
And so, why is that? I mean, was it a cover-up, or was it as planned as that?
Cover-up's a nasty word, sir. I don't know. I think that, you know, I worked in journalism for a while. I think you've dabbled in it yourself. Editors and producers tend to be kind of in love with their own conception of the story. Now they've invested 5 years in sort of framing the story, and I think that they just tend to start believing their own version of things.
The thing is the result of all this that New Orleans is going to be safe, now going to be safe, because they've learnt the lessons of what went wrong last time, or have they not learnt the lessons, and is New Orleans, well, in danger of happening again?
If you ask the Army Corps of Engineers, who are the miscreants in this whole thing, all they will say is New Orleans is safer than it's ever been. Now, this is like saying from the guy who ran over your grandmother with a Buick, you know, I got the brakes repaired. Yeah. So she's safer than she's ever been. Maybe this time I'll only dent her. Right. I would say, based on one of the lead investigators, the Corps is still using a very low, what's called factor of safety, which is cushion, engineer talk for cushion, safety factor. They use a much higher factor of safety for rural dams than they do for a levee project that is supposed to protect a major metropolitan area. They're still doing that. They still don't have really truly independent peer review of their projects. They're still making patches and fixes. There's a whistleblower in my film who says that as of today, New Orleans could be seriously flooded again. We've been very lucky. A major hurricane hasn't come near the city since 2006. Yeah. So I think the Corps of Engineers has been banking on luck so far.
And one of the reasons that your film has had the impact it has is obviously that you've done so many other things, and this is a new or newish departure, in fact,
yeah.
A crusading documentary. But I mean, you started off in this business. I mean, you debuted at the age of 7, didn't you? Or
yes, yes. I began on the Jack Benny program at the age of 7. Walked into not just, I mean, I as a child had always wanted to be in the adult world. I thought the whole childhood thing was kind of lame. And adult world, I walked into the coolest adult world imaginable, the Jack Benny program, with this master of comedy and this wonderful, generous, smart, incredibly talented man who ran a show that was just like the best place imaginable to be in show business.
And I mean, then this is Spinal Tap. I mean,
yes.
That's another landmark in your life.
Yes.
It? And that film, which didn't have huge grosses in the first year necessarily, but I mean, was celebrated like a real cult film at the age of 25, wasn't it?
Yes.
Just a few years back.
Yes, the Smithsonian has, you know, inducted it into its Hall of Fame of movies and stuff. And what's very rewarding about it is that it's now rolled over 3 or 4 generations. Kids come up to me now, 14, 15-year-old kids, and say, I learned what not to do in my band by watching that film. Really? It's an educational movie now.
Fantastic. Now, what about The Simpsons? How long have you been doing The Simpsons?
We have been doing it for 22 years, and we're now starting season 23.
And Mr. Burns is your favorite of the characters?
Yes, Mr. Burns, C. Montgomery Burns, quite an evil character, and
but what I love about him is that he does not try to trowel over the evil with any semblance of good whatsoever, not the scintilla of...
Yes, you said that that's the key, that the key to him is that he basks in evil.
Yes.
Pure evil.
Pure. There's a purity, there's a 99.9% purity to him that I admire greatly.
Yeah. Which of you, how many characters have you played in the whole course of The Simpsons?
Wow. Dozens. You know, bigger and smaller characters.
And who's your second favorite after Mr. Burns?
Ned Flanders.
Yeah?
Ned Flanders, because he's a true Christian American.
Yeah.
He really...
That Christian thing is interesting, yeah.
Yeah, he represents something that I'm fascinated about in the course of the history of The Simpsons. When it started out, all the right-wing Christians attacked the show. It's a bad role model for kids, it's subversive, it's irreverent, and by 15 years on, the 2 characters that I play, 2 of the characters I play, Ned Flanders and Reverend Lovejoy, were being cited by Christian magazines as the only 2 religious characters on commercial American television on a weekly basis. And they were doing cover stories on the fact that, why, this is a show about a family that actually goes to church. So they
actually believes in God.
It's amazing. They turned totally around. And it just proves that if you're on the air for 15 years, the blind men will finally see the whole element.
They'll come around in the end. So what's ahead? What would you like to do next or sometime?
I have a musical comedy that a colleague and I have written on the life of J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh, great.
Yes, called J. Edgar, ! And I have a series...
Not many love scenes in that.
A couple.
Not many heterosexual love scenes.
There, you are correct, sir. And a documentary series that I'm about to start work on about carnival around the world, because I'm fascinated with the subject of carnival in every place that it's sort of attached itself to.
Oh, terrific. Well, we look forward to you coming back and telling us all about that.
Love to.
And good luck with this film, this crusading documentary.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
The world is currently witnessing huge numbers of public protests, many brought on by the global economic crisis, protests against cuts, banks, capitalism, and so on. There are strikes, mass marches, and of course some violent protests as well. But what works? And what about the people in those countries like Zimbabwe and Myanmar, where public protest brings a violent backlash? And the new kids on the block, they are the computer hackers. Could they change the nature of protests? With me right now is Peter Tatchell, a seasoned protester who once tried to make a citizen's arrest of Robert Mugabe. A great moment in his career. Welcome, Peter. And then we have Zimbabwean Knox Chitiyo, back with us again, the head of the Africa program at the Royal United Services Institute. And we've got, he, by the way, has not tried to arrest Robert Mugabe so far, have you? Would that be?
No, I haven't.
No. And Claire Solomon, president of the University of London Union, who was in the thick of the protests in London yesterday. And, well, let me turn to you first of all. How often do you think that violence in protests, like we saw yesterday, but violence in protests does a good job, does a positive job for the cause?
Well, first of all, I think we have to just separate, we have to make a distinction between violence on people and violence on inanimate objects. I would call this vandalism and or criminal damage. And I think there have been many cases throughout history where people have engaged in these forms of protests and has achieved massive results. When suffragettes used to go around with small toffee hammers smashing windows, and now we celebrate the fact that women have the vote. And there are many instances where this has been successful.
Peter, what do you feel about this this question of violence? Can it be productive?
I think that in a democratic society where the opportunity exists for social change via democratic means, it's very difficult to ever justify violence, and I would not support it. I think violence distracts from the cause that people are espousing. It's counterproductive in that sense. Instead of thinking about the issues that people are protesting, the focus turns on the tactics they've used. So I would see myself as in the Gandhian mode of non-violent protest, but in certain circumstances I am prepared to follow a higher conscience, to break the law and to take the consequences.
To take your homeland as an example, it's scarcely practical as well as it's not very productive.
Yes, I mean, Zimbabwe is a rather different situation than here in the UK, and certainly in Zimbabwe, and not just Zimbabwe, but other countries, perhaps in Africa. The problem is if you use violence, then you have an escalation where violence begets counter-violence from the authorities, and you have an escalating situation in which more and more innocent people get injured. So it's very difficult to try and justify a violent protest, even in an authoritarian situation.
I mean, what does one do if one is, for instance, a student wanting to bring democracy to somewhere like Myanmar? I mean, what can you do as a protester that won't just leave you in prison?
Well, I think there are some very positive examples of mass non-violent protest against authoritarian regimes that have succeeded. One was the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia against the communist tyranny there, and the other was the mass people power protest in the Philippines, which toppled the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. So sometimes peaceful mass protests can work even against great tyranny, but of course we've also seen peaceful protests in Iran after the rigged election results, presidential election results, which brought hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets, but did not succeed because they were very savagely and violently repressed.
If I could just raise one other point with regard to the wider environment and the protests. A number of the protests in Africa at the moment, or that have been this year, are not just political, but also against things like failures in service deliveries and so on and so forth. So the protests are not simply anti-government or anti-political protests. It's also protests about a failure of government to deliver on various service promises that they made during elections. And we've seen that through a number of countries in Africa this year. So that's perhaps just another thing to consider with regard to Africa.
Absolutely. And where do we go from here? I mean, for instance, what about the protests we've seen this week in this country? Is there going to be greater violence inevitably, inexorably going forward here or elsewhere?
Make it clear where the violence is coming from. It's the government that are smashing our education and smashing our public services and therefore the whole of our society. It is the police that are smashing students on demonstrations. We passed motions and we made posters and advertising calling for peaceful demonstrations, and majority of the people went along on these demonstrations with expecting this and expecting the police to facilitate the protest, as opposed to being charged by horses, battened, kettled so tight that people could not sit down, without food and water and in the cold for 9 hours. This is clearly going to make anybody angry.
The vital thing really isn't the vital thing here who started it, and most people, or the police would say, that the students attacking started it. You would say that the police started it, would you?
In this particular instance, the police are the ones that provoked the students.
But whoever started
or
it,
beat up the students.
Peter?
Whoever started the violence in London, in a democracy, the police should not be behaving in that way. And when people are being treated like this, and they see their friends being bashed by the police, of course they get angry. And that, I think, inflamed the situation and provoked some people who would not have acted violently to do so. Of course there were troublemakers, and that was wrong. I don't agree with it. But the police have to act in a more restrained and controlled way, and kettling thousands of people, peaceful, lawful protesters, holding them against their will for hours and hours, that is an abuse of police power. It's unlawful, and it inflames and exacerbates the situation.
Knox.
Well, as someone who's not been in this country for too many years, speaking as an African, I think it was amazing to see what we've seen yesterday. It's two things. I think one is it shows that in terms of police tactics in dealing with sort of urban unrest or real issues, they really, really need to rethink their tactics. They seem overstretched and, in a sense, unable to cope. The second is there may be a wider impact here, because when Britain then goes to the rest of the world and talks about authoritarianism and security services dealing with people, people will come back and say, well, look what's happened here in London. These are the images that the wider world is seeing. So I think it's a very, very serious issue here in terms of Britain's image.
Taking a global overview, everywhere in the world, wherever there is violent protest, it has its seeds usually in injustice. People who are treated fairly and respect don't protest, they don't riot. They're well behaved, they're responsible citizens. But when people feel pushed into a corner, whether it's because of poverty, public spending cuts, racism, or any other kind of injustice, people tend to, at a certain point, just say they've had enough. And that's when peaceful protest spills over into violence.
Good points all round. Thank you all very much indeed for being with us. Since independence, 50 years ago, bloodshed has dominated Sudan's history. 2 civil wars between the largely Muslim north and the predominantly Christian south left over 2 million people dead and 4 million people displaced. Now, in just 1 month's time, southern Sudan will vote on whether to permanently break away from the north to become the world's newest nation. But will the January referendum go as planned? Or is there any danger that this vast country might descend back into violence? I'm joined now by Southern Sudan's Health Minister, Dr. Luka Manoja. Dr. Manoja, welcome very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
And very good to have you with us. What is the mood in Southern Sudan? With just literally a month to go, as we just said, what is the mood in Southern Sudan, for instance? Is it hope, fear, sadness, joy? How do the people feel about this decision?
The people feel upbeat and hopeful. We have no reason to be sad, we have no reason to be apprehensive. And 2 days ago we completed the registration for the vote, and in a few days' time we will be verifying the list, and we are ready to vote exactly 1 month from today.
And what do you predict that will be a big victory for Southern Sudan, a small one, or what?
I think more than 90% of Southern Sudanese who registered will cast their votes. and they will choose, they will demonstrate the choice which they have wanted to make since 1953.
And is there a danger that there could be disagreements which lead to war, or do you think that force and violence are on the back burner now, and this will be peaceful? The results of this election will be peaceful, whatever they are?
We are committed to peace, and our president has promised to our people and to the world that he will never take the South nor the Sudan to peace. We do not see any cause for no peace. We don't seek war. We have never sought war. And we think that the climate in which we are operating now, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and its consequences are the only basis for peace in Sudan. So Sudanese, I think across the border, are relieved that the last 6 years is for them an example how they can live peacefully.
And you have great oil reserves and so on, but at the same time, in southern Sudan, 1 in 5 children under 5 die. Malnutrition rates are at 50%. You have the highest maternal mortality rate in the world. Why with prosperity around the corner with the oil, why are things so bad at the moment? Difficult?
Well, exploitation of oil, which you refer to, only started in 1999. And the resources, those oil resources are controlled, and the money is cashed by Khartoum, not by the Southern Sudan. So irrespective of our wealth, we do not have access to that money. Yes, mortality is very high, and that was part of the reason why I'm in the UK, United Kingdom this week, to mobilize collaboration with British health workers so as to enable us train health workers who will instrumentally influence the reduction in maternal mortality and increase the health of our people, especially children.
And how many people who've fled from southern Sudan will come back if and when you're victorious in this referendum?
People have been coming back since January 2005, and they are streaming continuously now, both from the north and from other countries beyond our borders. They are always coming back. You will realize a few of those people have settled in their newly adopted country, and they come to visit us. They are still welcome. They help to establish links between the Southern Sudan and those countries. But many of our population in the Northern Sudan have largely come back. We have still got a stream of people moving. Even as I'm talking to you now, and people are preparing to vote, people are moving every day by boat, by car, by plane.
And do you feel at this moment optimistic in the sense that the outcome of this referendum, whatever it is, will not lead to war between North and South?
I'm certain, because our leadership under President Kiir does not believe in war. And he has said to the world and to the North that we have known what war is, and there is no reason to return to it. For the Southern Sudanese, we don't see any harbinger of war.
Well, we wish you well. We wish all of Sudan well. We wish you peace throughout the land, the largest landmass in Africa, and may it be a peaceful place for you to live and for the people of the North to live. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much too.
Well, that's all for this week. Coming up soon, our annual roundup of the year's people and events, and then our highlight show featuring this year some of the guests who've joined us since the summer, including Tony Blair, the exclusive interview at the launch of his autobiography, General David Petraeus and Hamid Karzai, both of whom we met in Afghanistan. From the world of tennis, the champion, or in fact Nadal might dispute that, but anyway, Roger Federer. From the world of movies, Gina Davis, of course, and from the world of business, who else but Bill Gates. That's all coming up soon, but that's it for this week. See you in a week's time.